Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. President Trump has declared a national emergency and invoked the Defense Production Act as the White House and Congress are at work on a series of financial packages in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic that, if enacted, would total more than $1.5 trillion and include cash handouts to average Americans, tax breaks for businesses, and more than $50 billion for airlines that have seen a plunge in traffic, and $10 billion or more for jet maker Boeing that is now reeling from the continued grounding of its 737 MAX jetliner and is expected to see a plunge in orders as air carriers delay or cancel their orders. Northrop Grumman, among other companies, is already warning investors that COVID-19 will have an impact. The question everybody is asking is what impact this global pandemic will have on military spending and national security. Here to answer some of those questions and more are our roundtable, Dr. Gordon Adams of the Quincy Institute, Byron Allen of Capital Alpha Partners, Michael Herson of American Defense International, and Dr. Dov Zakheim, former Pentagon comptroller, who is now a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, why don't you start us off and give us a kind of a quick update on where we stand on what's passed, what's in the works, what the invocation of the Defense Production Act means. Dov and Gordon, you guys may want to participate in that as well, and how DoD broadly is responding, because I think that everybody's heads are reeling with all the stuff that's going on, and I know that you, as the chief of one of the nation's leading defense lobbying firms, have your fingers on the pulse.
Thank you. We've come a long way in a very short period of time. I think we've already passed two supplementals. I think you saw the first supplemental spending measure, the president had only requested $2 billion. And now here we are, two supplementals later on the third one, talking about over $1 trillion. So that first supplemental started at 2 and ended up at 8.3. Second one is about 100 billion. And now Congress is feverishly working on the third. The initial one's really aimed at paid sick leave, shoring up loans for small businesses, and doing what they can to help the workforce. Now there's a lot of talk of how can we stimulate the economy and stave off dramatic unemployment that Secretary Mnuchin has been talking about. The third stimulus will really be focused a lot on helping the aviation industry, and then doing other things to pump money into the economy, and also giving checks directly to Americans. 250 billion to be spent in April, another 250 billion to be spent again in May. And then also more money for small business interruption loans. So they're very close to a deal. There's no deal yet. There will be some defense money in this bill, but predominantly focused just on the defense health programs. We've seen the Department of Defense step up by sending the Army Corps of Engineers to New York, hospital ships deployed to both the East Coast and the West Coast to help overcrowding of hospitals. The U.S. military labs are stepping in to help test for coronavirus. And the DoD also has said that they will provide respirator masks and other personal protection equipment and ventilators to help with the shortfalls. They're also considering mobilizing the National Guard to assist states with planning, logistics, medical support. 18 governors have already mobilized their guardsmen to help operate testing facilities and staff emergency operation centers. Transport health workers who don't have to take public transportation, and do what they can to clean public spaces. So there's three supplementals, as we mentioned, two passed, one now in the works, and they should have a deal soon. The House of Representatives is out of session, and they would have to come back to vote on this. And that's a real challenge too, because we've got to get members too. There's got to be flights for them to fly back on, and many have to show the courage to get back on an airline again and fly back here, because they're putting themselves at tremendous risk. We've already seen two members of the House of Representatives test positive for coronavirus, and I think there'll probably be more where those came from. You saw the president invoke the Defense Production Act the other day. Obviously, that raised a lot of questions among industry, because it's not something that people are used to dealing with. A lot of my industry folks that I work with were concerned, hey, does this mean they're going to take my missile factory and force me to turn it over and make ventilators. And that's not the case. I mean, there is no talk right now within the White House or on Capitol Hill about nationalizing industries. You know, what this will allow is the DoD and HHS to inject capital through what's called Title I of the Defense Production Act, which really would just increase capacity for companies that are already making masks, swabs, ventilators, et cetera. And this money has already been budgeted and appropriated in the DoD and in HHS. Now, there is talk of a fourth, fifth, and sixth supplemental / stimulus package on the Hill. The fourth is the one that would be geared toward defense. And the argument they're making to the president is, hey, when the Obama administration passed stimulus package in 2009, they did not include defense. So, hey, maybe we should include defense here too to help stimulate the economy. Now, the Senate has taken the lead on putting that together, and they have put together a package of about 18 billion plus worth of procurement items. However, that is not sitting well with the Democrats. It's not sitting well even with the Senate Republican leadership, and not necessarily sitting well with the Pentagon. Many of those programs were either taken from the UFA list or from the reprogramming that went over earlier this year to try and reconstitute those. But I think there's some question about the optics. Should we be spending more money on these defense systems when, one, we are short, testing and surgical gowns and masks and things that we need to respond to the crisis, and two, and more importantly, industry is not asking for these items. There are things that industry is asking for that they feel they need to survive this crisis. Now, AIA has been working closely with industry, the Aerospace Industries Association, and the same with NDIA. AIA has already put out a press release, and they're working with the Hill to try and inject public and private investment. Liquidity is a major concern among a lot of defense contractors. Anything they can to support their workforce and support their supply chain. There's some of the industry partners are working together too to supplement what AIA is doing, again, to talk about cash flow and liquidity, contractual relief, job retention tax credits. So these are things that are not going to cost as much money and will help stimulate to keep the defense money flowing. There's a lot of concern that RFPs aren't continued to be issued, that contracts aren't going to be signed. They want to put pressure on the building to continue to obligate funds. There's a lot of concern. There's a letter put out by NDIA and the Professional Services Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other groups worried about contractor employees. A lot of major defense contractors supply contractor support. It's part of the total force policy. If these contractors can't show up at these installations to do their work, they can't work from home because a lot of the work they're doing classified and they can't get paid. So how are we going to work that as well? And they're looking for bill language to give them some kind of equitable adjustment. So I think industry has thought this out very well, and they've got some really concrete plans that they are floating on Capitol Hill. The question is, which vehicle is it going to be able to go into?
Byron, let me bring you in as a longtime market watcher. Some of these initiatives, and we've seen a variety of different measures by the Fed, including sort of a $1.5 trillion loan effort week before last. Then there was the $900 billion in quantitative easing and other measures. And then it also included a steep interest rate drop. Some of these things only terrified the market more. At the end of the day, market was still down with some suspension of trading today, Thursday, as we tape this. Where are we going and how's the market looking at this? And are any of these investments actually going to end up moving a needle?
I think you have to think about it in a couple of ways. And first, I just want to, Michael gave a very comprehensive overview of that. I thought kind of an interesting thing that I've been thinking about is kind of how Congress deals with all this right now. I think, he mentioned 2 had been tested positive. I think 20 congressmen are actually in self-isolation. And there was some talk about maybe moving to remote voting. That's going to be interesting. But you suddenly, go compress the congressional calendar this year, which maybe already was compressed because of the election. So it's a very full agenda when you think about it, even just this next package, this stage 3 package. Look, the market reaction, it's going to bounce around, I think, as the, we're really living day by day. And to Michael's early point, it's just amazing how quickly these numbers have escalated. I could point out from personal experience, the same was true in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. We're really still in kind of the discovery phase on this. And people are starting to connect all these separate little dots that bear on GDP expectations. I know this week, I think Goldman Sachs kind of kicked it off Monday morning with an estimate that this quarter's GDP or next quarter's GDP would be around down 5%. If you blended the two, JP Morgan came out with a down 14% estimate. We're now talking about a global recession. And as you look at what's going on in Europe, the Italian numbers are still rising. We're still not at the knee of the curve for coronavirus in the United States. So it's going to be a moving target. And I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if these numbers for fiscal stimulus move higher, frankly, significantly higher.
Dov and Gordon, together you guys have nearly, I'm not trying to date either of you, both are still in your prime, but nearly a century of national security and government experience. At the end of the day, we're talking about doing this through deficit spending. How does that work? I mean, we're looking at a deficit now of a national debt of $22 trillion. Some folks are estimating that we could be at 28 by the time we get through this, with both direct impacts, contracted economy. All of this makes sense when rates are low, but when rates start to go up, it changes the dynamic. At the end of the day, what's going to be the impact on defense spending? Because I think that there's a sense we should be spending a little bit more on defense. On the other hand, there is the question of, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we be producing some of the things and acquiring some of the things that we need in a more rapid fashion? And at the end of the day, is defense going to be a bill payer?
Well, there's a limit to how much, this stuff here, the limit to how much defense can be a bill payer, even if you want it to be. For a start, you're absolutely right. If the rates go up, I mean, right now the rates are at zero. So if the rates inevitably go up, that means that debt servicing will go up, and that's going to swamp everything else, frankly, and certainly defense. And so where's the money going to come from to pay off all this interest? It'll have to come not from domestic programs, particularly, if Mr. Trump is not reelected, it's going to come from defense, but there are limits to how much it can impact on defense. I think the one thing that's clear is defense spending is simply not going to rise. I mean, already the plan was for essentially a flat defense budget. We're at record highs right now, and it's very, very hard to see how defense spending will go up given the current circumstances, and we don't even know how long those will go on. I mean, if this virus sticks around for 18 months or recedes in the summer and comes roaring back in the winter like the Spanish flu did in 1918, then you're going to have even more pressure on the deficit. And, tricks like OCO and so on are just going to be almost like rounding errors relative to the problems that we're going to face. While I still am speaking, one thing that I think is very important, you can't just think about the big primes in terms of the impact of this thing. Where the real hurt is taking place is with the small businesses, the third tier and fourth tier suppliers. They're finding that people are holding back on their payables, which means that the suppliers are not getting their receivables. They also don't know how long they can hold on to their people. So you've got a supply chain, leaving aside whatever supplies we get from overseas, which is a whole other problem. You've got a supply chain that is literally crumbling before our eyes. And unless the money gets to small businesses quickly enough to allow them to start paying other small businesses, we're going to have a big problem there. And that's a problem in defense as well as everywhere else.
Gordon, I want to bring you in, but one observation, Dov. I mean, Republicans aren't behaving like Republicans anymore either, right? I mean, so it's unlikely for me to think that, right? I mean, we've crossed a whole series of Rubicons during the Trump administration, and Republicans are sort of going along with the sort of big spending approaches, for example, that they have historically hurled stones at Democrats over, right? I mean, the debt only matters if Republicans are in charge and Democrats are in the White House, it seems to be. So, that's going to be the kind of interesting thing. I think that's
fair. I mean, Mr. Trump and his followers have broken just about every rule. But remember, too, that the Trump defense budgets Mr. Trump hasn't been, he talks about spending a lot more money, but the current defense budgets are probably where it's all going to peak. And there's no indication that even if Trump is reelected, he would spend more on defense. So, they've broken every rule, and the Republicans of now are not the Republicans that, frankly, that I've known for my professional life.
Gordon, take us away. And A, are these sort of government spending programs appropriate and necessary at a time like this? Is A. B, how do you think it's ultimately going to affect defense spending, or how do you think it should affect defense spending?
Well, first off, obviously, the primary question here is stimulus, which is why the dollar figures are so high, and the rapidity of the stimulus is why those $1,000 or whatever checks are going to be sent to all Americans. The idea is to get spending going. That works in a kind of a normal recession depression, if you will. 2009 comes to mind, but it's highly problematic at this point, when the mixed message is sequester yourself, don't go out, order indirect, and as we see in a series of industries now, public spending is down, and again down. So even with more money in their pockets, as a lot of people in the middle class watch their savings disappear in the stock market, as people are told to stay home and not go out for entertainment or flying or travel, the reality is this stimulus supplemental is going to have a hard time. So that's thing one, because it's hard to get people spending, and it's hard to get businesses spending if the supply chain disruptions are what we think they are. So that's point number one.
And to add, right, and it's further exacerbated in the public debate if it looks like companies are getting that money and returning it to shareholders as opposed to helping their employees or an investment or in other ways.
Looks bad. It's a disaster. But thing two, we are now in dystopia. We are in new terrain. This is not business as usual, which means a lot of the impacts and rules that we're used to are not going to apply here. The most important being, we don't know how long this is going to last. It is having huge employment effects. It is having huge effects in the health sector. It's having effects right across the economy in terms of values of shares. We are in new land here. So any rules that people say they know are in existence are in doubt. Point three, on the defense budget, the question you raised, Vago, I think we're likely to see supplementals as far as the eyes can see. And the reason is only partly requirements. There's not really a need in defense. I've said this before. A huge expansion of the defense budget has already happened. It may be flat, as Dov says, going into the future, but I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is politics. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are going to want to be said to make defense a bill payer. It's just not good politics. It may be goddamn good government, but it's not good politics. And we see that right now in the preparation of stimulus 4 that Michael talked about. That is good politics to put stuff into the defense budget, even if there's a downside for people to say, why them and not us? But that comes to my last point, which goes back to what we were talking about, and Michael in particular, about the Defense Production Act. Here's the problem with using the Defense Production Act, right? The problem is conversion is not going to happen here, right? And Michael's right about that. The defense industry is littered with failure stories about defense companies trying to do something that's not defense. They don't know how, they don't have the technological know-how, they don't have the marketing skills, they don't know what to do. Secondly, procurement dollars, the slowest goddamn dollars in the defense budget. So if you're trying to argue stimulus by throwing money into procurement, you're actually throwing it into the slowest outlay account, the slowest spending, and the system is jammed full. They're not going to suddenly ramp up and find new capacity here. Thirdly, the contractors are going to find supply chain disruptions all the way down in anything that they buy, overseas in particular. So it's not going to be possible to use that as a stimulus under the DPA. And fourthly, they may not have production workers. I live up here in Brunswick, Maine. I'm 8 miles from Bath Iron Works. Bath Iron Works employs 8,000 people in the state of Maine. How many of those 8,000 people are going to end up with coronavirus, are going to be out of work, are taking extra leave? And they are taking extra leave even though Bath Iron Works and its parent company, General Dynamics, has not countered this, has said, okay, workers, you can take 80 hours off, but you don't get paid. This is a public company operating on taxpayer dollars. It's unconscionable, frankly, that workers are not getting paid leave in order to take care of their families and their needs right now. But the bottom line here is the defense sector is not going to be the stimulus success story that saves the American economy. We're really challenged because it's dystopia.
Vago, let me just jump
go
in
ahead,
for a
Doug.
second. I don't know about where the defense budget's going to go because none of us really knows. But with regard to the Defense Production Act, Title III, Michael mentioned Title I, but Title III allows loans, loan guarantees, and most important, it allows the government to buy all kinds of stuff that's needed. And the government's still pretty good at distribution. Certainly, it's critical to get as much of these ventilators and masks and everything else around to the right people. So if the president really has to, he's invoked it, but he actually has to implement it.
Amen.
Because under Title III, there's a lot of stuff that can be done that goes well beyond what you might be doing for the Northrops and the Lockheeds and so on. It's a completely different issue here. And as I said, it's not just overseas where you're going to have a supply chain problem. It's domestically, and the ones who are going to be hit absolutely the hardest are the third and fourth tier suppliers.
Absolutely. Agree 100%.
Well, let me go to Byron and Michael quickly on that before we go to the broader presidential electoral implications of this. Go ahead, Byron.
No, but I mean, I think it's interesting because I mentioned it in the opening that Northrop Grumman had this SEC filing where they added coronavirus risk factors. It was interesting. It wasn't a press release. It was an SEC filing of Form 8K, and that stock is down 9% today. So defense had been kind of viewed as a safe haven. It certainly is not going to see the demand destruction that you're seeing in the airline or commercial aerospace sector. But I think there was kind of maybe a belated awakening that there are vulnerabilities here, and there are going to be workforce disruptions, and this sector is not immune from coronavirus. I absolutely agree. You know, I think the number one ask in the Navy's list was another Virginia class submarine. You know, that's money that would affect work in 2022, 2023,
exactly.
25. I mean, it's not going to have any impact at all on what's going to happen in this economy over the next 3 to 6 months.
And of course, right, I mean, look at the implications. And the F-35 is one of the world's most important defense programs. It is it's history's largest defense program. It's the most international of defense programs. And Italy is a key member on that. Turkey is a key partner on it. Britain is obviously the number one tier partner on it, right? I mean, so there are industrial implications across the piece. South Korea is a partner on the program, as is obviously Japan. Michael, you know, how is that granular debate going? Because as Gordon and Dove sort of pointed out, right, it's one thing to invoke the Defense Production Act. It's another thing to actually start getting stuff out of it. And the prudent might say one of the reasons why fatality rates elsewhere have been higher is a lack of access to the number of ventilators. That, for example, an intensive care ward or an ICU ward or even a room in ICUs in the United States come with a ventilator or respirator as standard equipment. That's not the case overseas. And I have friends who think they have the coronavirus and are basically told, stay at home, have your fever, have a cough. What's the nature of the discussion there about how the government should be mobilizing and actually get some of the things that might be in greatest need, like ventilators, masks, medical supplies, acceleration of clinical trials, you name it?
Beyond throwing money at it, there is no real plan to get there. Even the DoD's supply of respirators is a very small number. Our ventilators, I think it's only about 5,000, which they're going to, put into the mix, which really makes a very small dent in the problem. But the people on the Hill, for the most part, have been pretty reactive to this, and I think the administration has been reactive. And you saw they started a $2 billion request, and the president was surprised that Congress made it into $8.3 billion. Now he's the one who's saying we got to go big when. Initially, the third supplemental was going to be $850 billion, and now we're talking over $1 trillion. So it's really that's not a lot. I mean, obviously that conversation is going on. People are hoping that somebody's going to come up with a magic answer, But in the meantime, a lot of the focus is going to be on how do we, sustain our economy and sustain our workforce. And, when you look at the money they're talking about, for example, for the aviation industry or for companies like Boeing, there's a concern that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we made in the financial crisis, where we pumped money into banks and insurance companies and they sat on it. So they want to make sure that this money ends up in the supply chain. And at the same time, some great points were raised earlier by Byron on the workforce. Already, people on the Hill are telling me that constituents who work for major defense contractors are calling them, saying, complaining that they have to show up to work. They don't want to go to work. They're afraid to go to work because they're afraid they're going to get sick. And there is some discussion up there that, well, how in danger really are factory workers, because by nature they are kind of social distance. If you ever walk through a defense factory, you see how spread out people are. Many are wearing masks already to protect themselves against debris and fumes that are in there. We're looking for ways how do we keep this workforce going, and we've already started to see more aviation layoffs. I mean, I can't mention the company because one of my clients would just announce a large layoff yesterday. So I think that's really a lot of the focus down the Hill is waiting for the magic answer. What do we need to do to fund the necessary programs to get the masks and the ventilators ready out there? But in the meantime, what can we do to stave off economic disaster?
In my judgment,
Go ahead.
there is one element here that matters to almost everything else we've talked about today, and it's the one we can control least. That is, how long does this last, and what's the pace of the recovery? Because a lot of this can be tempered if the pace of the recovery is very quick. The longer it lasts, the deeper the damage, the harder it is to avoid any of the negative consequences that we're talking about. So length and pace of recovery are the long pole in the tent here.
A couple of other items. First, implementation. Will the government be in a position to actually implement? I'll give you two examples. One is the hospital ships. So everybody's talking about, there's one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, except the one on the East Coast is in maintenance, and it's not clear if they don't have all the workers, how long it'll take to get it out of maintenance so it can go up to New York. So that's number one. I mean, how do you actually get things out there?
Well, I should add also about the hospital ships. They take many, and even in the best cases when those ships are available, it takes weeks and weeks, up to 6 weeks, to get them, or about a month, to get everybody mobilized, crew on them, ships up and running, to get them out to sea.
And they have to get the doctors. So there's that as well. Then the other element of implementation is, look, they talk about loans. So I'm talking to one small business owner who says to me, a small business loan is $75,000. My weekly payroll is $300,000. What good is it going to do me? So what might be happening is that before we actually get the money out to these smaller suppliers that are critical to the defense chain, a lot of them might go belly up. They might not get the people coming in. They might not get enough money to pay the people who do come in. This could be absolutely critical. So, and I don't get the sense, maybe you guys, the rest of you have it, I don't get the sense that beyond simply, voting for money, there's a real sense of how to implement. Another example, by the way, if you look at how Singapore's been handling this, they reacted to the SARS thing already in the early 2000s. And then they reacted again when the bird flu hit. So by the time this thing hit, they had a vehicle for tracking anybody who got ill, where they were, who they met with, and so on. We've got nothing like that. We don't, not only not testing, but even if we do test, do we track everybody and where they are, what they're doing, who they've seen, and so on? So implementation is just out the window as far as I can see.
I literally heard the representative of the New York City Department of Health today on the phone saying they were only doing in-hospital testing. They were not testing outpatients. How you determine what the pace and vector of the disease is when you're not doing outpatient testing is a mystery to me.
Well, look, I mean, even if you want to find testing, you have to either call your doctor or go to the CDC, right? I mean, so testing is very embryonic at this point. And there are people who actually are more likely than not having been exposed. And even if they fill all the criteria of, I've met with people from China, or I met with people who have been to Singapore recently, or what have you, they're told, well, even you don't fit the criteria testing, which is rather extraordinary. So I think actually all of these numbers could be disproportionately low.
Quite.
That even in the United Kingdom, for example, that until a couple of days ago hadn't really done much of anything in order to prepare itself.
As Dov was saying, there is not a serious plan. We were ill prepared for it.
Correct.
We have not marshaled a serious plan since we started preparing for it, and we still don't have a serious plan. I can tell you in every state, the system for testing is different in every single state, let alone the availability of test kits.
Well, I want to pivot off that because, maybe just for industry, there might be an optimistic or a silver lining to this, and that is some of the opportunities that could emerge in 2021 or 2022 to address that. What is going to be the national plan to deal with a pandemic, another pandemic in the future? I mean, I think there's going to be a presumption that these aren't issues that just happen every 100 years, maybe the same way that we've learned that major storms, things like Maria or Katrina are no longer, 1,000-year events. I mean, so that's one aspect that I think people ought to be thinking about. Another, look, there's going to be a big shakeout in industry. To Dov's standpoint, a lot of companies are going to go under. For the ones that have capital, that have access to liquidity, there's probably going to be more consolidation in these sub-tiers of supply chain. I don't know what really is going to be the outcome for Boeing's problems. Is that going to be a restructuring that's happening under duress with their defense business being separated from their commercial business? I don't know, but I mean, you can see some of those things playing out depending on how severe and how long this is for commercial aerospace. And it has a potential to really reshape the defense sector and the professional services sectors when you think into 2021 and 2022. And I think that's what maybe boards, as much as they're dealing with the crisis of today, how do they keep, and managements, how do they keep their employees, solvent and workable? I think, stepping back a little bit though, there's going to be some really interesting opportunities on the other side of this crisis when we start to see that sunlight.
The fragility of the industrial base has repeatedly been demonstrated. I mean, I remember Lockheed, one of the things that cratered them in the 90s was traveling waveguide tubes from Germany. And when the supply got interrupted, that caused the domino effect across what was, otherwise a remarkably strong company. And I don't think that, a little more than a year ago, we would have been talking about Boeing, one of the world's truly great companies, facing what has emerged to be a completely existential threat.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing the subtext of this, particularly relative to the airline bailout. But the amount of money that companies have spent on share repurchases that has just gone up the chimney in smoke in destroyed value. I think there may be a second look at that by owners in the 2021-22 timeframe. Should you really be buying back your stock at levels that you really don't know if that's the best use of capital? Is it better to spend it on building more resilience in your own supply chain and your own facilities and your own workforce? So that's going to be another interesting vector to see if that plays out here. Of course, we could just forget about it and this is a one-off thing and we'll go back to doing what we've been doing over the past couple of years. I'm hopeful that doesn't happen.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Dov?
2 points. One, what worries me is that if this virus goes away for a few months and people breathe a sigh of relief, and as Byron just said, they go back to old habits, and then it comes back, that would be really destructive, and it could happen. As I mentioned, that's what happened with the Spanish flu. The other point that I think is worth remembering, and we've touched on it sort of tangentially, is the federal workforce and the contract workforce. In the Defense Department, contractors are basically, whatever the rules officially are basically working like federal officials. These are the people that are the least likely to show up for work, and there are, particularly in what's called the fourth estate, it's full of contractors. But those are the people that do a lot of the back office work. Those are the people that send out the checks and so on and so forth. And if they don't show up, I don't know how the Defense Department gets very much done. Nobody ever pays attention to the back office until it's missing.
I think that that's an exceptionally good point. Let's shift the conversation to the impact on the presidential race as everybody sees it. The president spent weeks telling the American people there was nothing to worry about, but is now saying that there's a calamity at hand and we have to move quickly. I think one of the key things that happened is that Democratic support coalesced behind Joe Biden, who is a threat, right? I mean, he did everything he could, and I think Republicans contributed to that to try to damage Joe Biden as much as possible. But now he looks like he is the most likely person who's going to become the Democratic nominee. Tulsi Gabbard dropped out. Bernie Sanders is the last one, and it's unclear after the performance this week whether Sanders is going to be able to regain any of the delegate gap that he faces. And while the president was saying that, very prominent and respected lawmakers like Bob Burr, the North Carolina Republican who's the Intelligence Committee chair on the Senate side, was warning top donors a month ago in a private meeting to prepare for financial and medical calamity. This was at the same time the president was saying the virus was a hoax. Now, in the end, the president's approval numbers have gone up a little bit, but now there are concerns of, okay, well, what were some of these prominent lawmakers telling their donors, and then how are those donors behaving as a result, for example? How does all of this affect the presidential race, and does the president come out of this stronger rather than weaker?
I'm a donor, and I wish somebody could give me that advice a month ago, so I could have been prepared. Look, I think there's definitely an impact on this race, and I think that Biden is capitalizing on it, and I think he's doing his best to show that he's presidential. I think his statement after winning the primaries of the night was not a typical, hey, I just won, 3 primaries, lots of balloons and cheering. It was very somber and very direct. He's already put an advisory team together of people to advise him on the coronavirus and our response. And I think that there's going to be a contrast between the two. I mean, we talked before about a plan. I mean, if you look back on the financial crisis, Congress relied on the administration, and we had pros in charge. We had Bernanke, we had Paulson, we had folks that came to the Hill and scared the crap out of them and said, here's what we got to do to right the ship. And it wasn't easy, but Congress followed along, and we eventually did right the ship. This time around, the president is really saying, hey, the governor's got to do this. The governor's got to do that. Don't wait for us for ventilators. Don't wait for us for this. You guys go do it. And if you leave this up to Congress, you're going to end up with 535 different ideas with every single bill. And we're really starting to see a lot of good ideas, but there's also a lot of bad ideas coming to fruition. And I think the administration's got to take a tighter hold of this. But I think the implications are serious for this election. And like I said on previous podcasts, I think the needle is moving very much in favor of the Democrats, regardless of the slight bump the president's seen in his approval rating. I think it's very temporary.
Yeah, there's been research on, if you have this kind of GDP contraction in the second quarter of a presidential election year, it is not good for the incumbent. What I'm also curious about is the impact on the Senate composition coming out of this. And I think that's I'm curious, particularly Gordon, Senator Collins, how this may impact her prospects. And there are other GOP candidates at risk here. And there is a potential that you can have Democrats in control of both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue as now a result of this coronavirus outbreak.
I think there's a stronger and stronger possibility that the Senate will be reversed, partly as a consequence of this. In the state of Maine, I like to call her Invisible Susan. Basically, we've heard very little from her about the crisis, about how to adapt to it, about how to adjust to it. We've certainly seen no public meetings, but she has been underwater now for months in terms of approval ratings. Her negatives are in the 50s, her positives are in the low 40s, and that's just one case. Arizona is going to be another case. There are now 5 or 6 districts. Montana is now a district. There are, what's critical here, I think, both for the presidential level and for the Senate level, is the same thing that I was saying earlier. How deep, how long, how fast is the recovery? If this thing were magically to disappear by the month of June and the recovery were get underway and the Dow was going up 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 points a day, then you could say that by and large, the president may get away with it. If we're still, as I expect we will be, in very bad territory in April, May, June, July, with the economy seriously in recession. As Byron says, I think it's hopeless for the president, and the prospects in the Senate rise for the Democrats. But how deep, how long, and how fast is the recovery are going to drive the political train.
I'm in agreement with what's been said. A couple of points. First, if the market doesn't go up 5,000 points, in other words, gets to where Obama's market was, he's finished right there. And I don't know how it gets 5,000 more points because, as Gordon just said, we don't even know how long this thing's going to drag on. So that's number one. Number two is Mike Gerson wrote a very interesting piece about who looks better on television, Pence or the president. The president still talks constantly about himself, and that'll work really well with his base. And maybe he'll pick up a half a point or a percentage or something from a couple of others. But all it's doing is further alienating the people who supported Biden, namely the African Americans, the suburban moms, the workers who are out of jobs or worried about losing their jobs and so on. So that's all going to help Biden. To me, the wild card, frankly, is Sanders.
I think he will endorse Biden, and I think he will do his best to elect a Democrat in the fall.
I hope so. From your mouth to God's ears, Gordon.
I am very interested to see how this race is going to unfold, but I do think that there are a whole series of liabilities that Bernie Sanders was bringing to the table that Republicans were particularly eager because they thought that they could exploit. Remember, both Moscow and many Republicans wanted Donald Trump to run against Bernie Sanders.
Including Donald Trump.
Yeah, he really wanted to, yes.
And I believe that one of the reasons the president so sharply turned tack was, oh my God, I'm facing Biden, and I'd better throw some money to the American people to be seen as though I'm doing something at the end of the day. So it's a political calculation. God willing, it has some positive effects on the American people at the end of the day, given the magnitude of this crisis. I mean, the only thing that I'm asking is, it's not like we didn't see this iceberg coming. We saw evidence that China was in chaos going all the way back to December before that's the reason why we have intelligence services. Before everybody goes, really quickly, I want to go around the horn because this is very, very fast moving. I want to take a look at the week ahead, and Dove, give you exactly 20 seconds to make your case. You wrote in the Hill that the European defense budgets are going to end up crashing as a result of this. Give us sort of the 20-second synopsis, and then I want to go quickly around the horn. Michael Herson had to sign off on what we should expect over the coming week. Go ahead.
Well, the head of the European Central Bank has said it's going to hurt very badly and is talking in terms of $500 billion as for a bailout and more than that. So bottom line is, given their social requirements, given immigration that's still pulling at them, defense is going to be a bill payer for them. They're not going to reach that 2%. And what we need to do is be a lot more tolerant of them at this time.
And very quickly, let's go around. Byron, Gordon, and then Dove ends it. What should we expect to see over the coming weeks? So by the time that this podcast reconvenes, what will we have seen, and what are you guys going to be looking to see?
Byron, it's probably going to look worse before it looks better.
Gordon?
The market will continue to go down. We will see probably subs 4, 5, and 6. The virus will spread. There's going to be a lot more scrambling before people can stop.
Dove?
Let's see if the government can finally get its act together. Otherwise, it's certainly going to get worse no matter what, but it'll be even worse than worse if the government still cannot get itself organized.
Should we be buoyed at all by the fact that China is reporting no additional new cases? Is that something that is a potential positive?
I don't know if you can really trust it, but what was interesting, there were reports about new infections in Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So that's why I think these notions that this was just going to be a one and done V-shaped event, it's still out there. And until you get a vaccine, I think all bets are off on how long and how deep this will go.
Agree.
Guys, thanks so very much for joining us. Really appreciate it, and look forward to having you guys back on next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vago.
Take care.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Check out our daily podcasts for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we hope everybody has a very happy and very safe weekend.